Okay, so a little bit more we need to talk about. Here's a history of recession, so we get this idea. We looked at that graph, but here's the history. So Truman, 11-month recession. Eisenhower was president for 8 years, had three recessions. Nixon was president for less than 8 years, had two recessions. Jimmy Carter had a recession. Reagan had a recession in 81. That's 40 years from the end of World War II until we had eight recessions, which is one every 5 years. Okay, in the first 40, 30, 40 years after that. Then we had 90. H.W. Bush has a recession. Then W. Bush has two of them. So perhaps we should never elect another President Bush because they have a lot of recessions. And Trump had a recession. So in 35 years since Reagan, we've only had four recessions. That's one every 8 years. So recessions have not only we have fewer of them and they're shorter in general. Not the big second Bush recession was the worst of all these recessions that are up here. But it's we had some short recessions, and the Trump recession is COVID. Though we were headed for a recession anyhow, everybody believes that we were going to have a recession in 2020. There are signs, there are omens of a recession coming, and we be talking about them as we go along here. There are signs. So funny things happen to interest rates. Employment starts to get weak. Things happen. Okay? And almost always when those things happen, when those warning signs happen, we have a recession. And so all those warning signs were happening in 2019 and into 2020, and then COVID hit, and we had this massive, very short but massive recession. So we probably would have had a recession in 2020. They might have done some things and pushed it off, so maybe it would have happened under Biden and not under, nobody knows. But there would have been a recession in there somewhere. Okay, so look at the dates on there and notice that the last Eisenhower recession and the Nixon recession, those are about 9 years apart. But all the other recessions are just a few years apart, right? There's 9, and then there's 4 to Nixon, and then there's 7 years till Carter, and then there's a year until Reagan. The Bush recession, there's a decade. There's almost 11 years between Dad having a recession and the kids' first recession, and then there's 6 years before we have a recession, and then there's 13 years before we have a recession. So people who are born in the 90s and the 2000s, they don't have the same picture of the economy as people who were born earlier. Their parents, and particularly your grandparents or your great-grandparents, people who lived through the Great Depression. My grandma, my mom's mom, when she died, she had government bonds and cash stashed all over her place because she came out of the Depression. She didn't trust banks. She had to have, basically half of all her resources were in her place because she didn't trust putting them into financial institutions. She got government savings bonds, so they were still earning interest, but the physical bond was in her closet. Okay? So that's something that's importante to understand, that we have this view of how things are, and that view has changed. Okay, so from June 2009 to February 2020, that's 120 months. That's 10 years and 3/4. That's the longest period of expansion in American history. So big chunk of your life has been the longest expansion in American history. And guess when the second longest expansion was? Yeah, well, so that was right before that. So if you were born if you're born in the 90s, you've lived through two of the three longest expansions in history. and that kind of shapes people's view of how these things are. Okay? The other interesting thing is, and I talked about this, I think, already, but I have this theory of how the economy works. There have been 12 recessions since World War II, 2 of them with Democrat presidents in the White House, and 10 of them with Republican presidents in the White House. And so, again, you know my theory of how the economy works, and we'll talk about this, and you can decide whether I'm right or wrong. It gives you a reason to go, oh, that professor, he doesn't know nothing. Or, But seriously, my theory of life is when things are good, we put Republicans in because they don't ever have a plan and they don't ever spend any money. And so we're happy that they're not spending a lot of money, and so we put the Republicans in. At some point, the cuts and the debt and the all pile up, and we get a recession, and then they go, okay, and we put the Democrats back in, right? So Bush had this huge, nastiest recession since the Great Depression. We put Obama in, he fixes it. Okay? Things are going, the Trump election is weirder because the economy was booming under Obama, and yet Trump ran on the economy sucks. The one maybe interesting thing about how things are working in our country these days is that the whole country never seems to catch fire or catch problems at the same time. So the economy was booming under Obama, but it was the coasts that really boomed, and the interior didn't do as well. Okay? So when Trump said, hey, the economy is not good, people who live in Nebraska went, hey, the economy is not as good as it should be. People in California were like, what are you talking about? People on the East Coast in Georgia and, North Carolina and places like that are going, wait. Economy's booming. What's the problem? Okay? So, yeah. How you look at things, right, depends on your point of view. Einstein was right. Theory of relativity. How you look at things changes how you see them. So, GDP is part of something called the National Income and Products Accounts. Now, in the old days, if you talk to your grandparents, they don't know anything about GDP. They learned about something called GNP. We used to do GNP. We were the only country in the world, really, that did GNP. Everybody else was using GDP long before us. GNP counts what your citizens do. GDP counts everything that happens in your country. So if you just think everybody in my country is and your citizens are doing all the work, then GNP is right. But as you live in a world where we have lots and lots of immigrants, GDP is a far better measure of what's going on in the economy. GNP would ignore everything that's done. All the farm workers, all the construction workers who are not citizens of the United States who work in this country, millions and millions of them, right? Their efforts would not count in GNP, but they count in GDP. So we can see the effect of them in GDP, all right? So there's this whole, it's an accounting system, right? And we're not going to go through the whole accounting system. I had to memorize the accounting system when I took this class. I still don't see the point of why I had to memorize that accounting system when I took this class, but I did a long time ago. I don't make you memorize it. There's no point in you memorizing it. But, so we already talked about why GNP is. There's things we can do with GDP. Now let's think about GDP for a second. It's about what we're producing, okay? It's not about how much income we have. It's about how we're producing. So you're retired, you're collecting Social Security, the government's sending you money, but that money's not in GDP because, hey, you didn't work to get that money. You worked in the past to get that money. You paid into the Social Security system. The money in the Social Security system with accumulations is getting paid back to you, okay? Just a note which we'll talk about here. When We have all sorts of people are running around now going, Social Security, we're having this national debt because of Social Security. Social Security has not put a dime into the national debt, not a dime. Social Security will at some point because all of the old generations are old and the young generations are smaller than the old generations. But it won't be till the 2030s probably until the Social Security would have some effect on the national debt. It has had exactly zero effect on the national debt at this point, right? None. None of the national debt is from, and we'll talk about that, none of the national debt is from Social Security. Anyway, so we have a thing called national income where we get rid of the parts of GDP that are just production kind of things, and we add into the part GDP all the stuff which is people's income, which isn't, so things like Social Security go in there, okay? What we really want to talk about, though, is personal income. We take the households and we say, how much income do the households actually have? From whatever source, how much income do they have? And that number is personal income. The cool thing about personal income is that we have personal income by state. So we can look at personal income from state to state, okay? And then there's also something called DPI, the disposable personal income, which is personal income after you pay your taxes, okay? We good there? So national income is a whole income of everybody, and that includes business income like profits and that kind of stuff. Personal income is the income that the households get, and disposable personal income is household income after tax. All right, so personal income per capita. How much money does the average household have in each state? All right? So the state with the highest personal income is Connecticut. Connecticut is high personal income because lots of the people who work in Manhattan, work in New York City, all your big mucky mucks, they live in Connecticut, many of them. So a lot of the richest people who work in New York actually live in Connecticut. So the household income shows up in Connecticut. So Connecticut is the per capita, per person, the richest state. Massachusetts right after that. New Jersey right after that. New York. And again, Connecticut and New Jersey are getting their money from New York, but New York comes in fifth. And Maryland. And again, Maryland, a lot of people who live in Maryland work in Washington, D.C. So the more well-to-do Washington, D.C. people, a lot of them live in Maryland. Okay? So those are the richest states. Now, I'm about to show you the poorest states. Let's remember one thing, and we talked about this before. A house we were talking about it in terms of international, right? A house in the U.S. costs more than a house in China or India, and we need to adjust for that. We don't adjust personal income for those differences. A house in California costs a lot more money than a house in Alabama. And you can say, hey, there's other things in California. In California, you get a view of the beach. It's not humid. You don't have to live with people from Alabama. You know what I mean? But so we do these comparisons, but there's problems with the comparisons, right? Because we're comparing high-cost states. A house in Connecticut or New York costs a lot more money than a house in Arkansas, okay? But the poorest states are Kentucky, New Mexico, South Carolina, West Virginia, and Mississippi, okay? So again, in the political debate, the Democrats will point out that almost 9 out of the 10 most high-income states are Democrat-run states, where most of the population is Democrat. All 10 of the lowest, 9 of the 10 lowest income states are Republican, solid Republican. But again, there's all kinds of issues there, right? The Democrats used to have a lot of the low-income states because the Democrats were the party of the middle class and the low-income people. Now what's happened is the Democrats are the party of some higher, better educated people, right? If we look at what your education is, the more education you have, the less likely you are to be Republican and the more likely you are to be a Democrat. Okay? And you can have debates. There's podcasters who think that us college professors indoctrinate you guys. College professors think, hey, no, we're teaching you to think, and people who think tend to be less hateful, less biased, less. And so you can, whatever argument you want to take it. It's yours, right? You get to believe. We believe. Whatever you believe, you have to believe. And you can, however you live in your belief system, that's how you believe in your system. But Democrat states tend to be richer than Republican states. Democrat states also tend to have higher house prices than Republican states. Democrat states tend to have better education systems, do better on tests like SATs and ACTs than Republican states do. Okay? And so part of that is values. I don't, again, thinking about this is your job, right? But we have this disparity. And again, Kentucky and South Carolina and West Virginia and Mississippi in the 50s and 60s were solid Democrat, right? And it's only, and over time, since the Reagan Revolution, they have shifted over and become solid Republican. California, which is in the list of the top 10 richest states, they used to be solid Republican. There was a time when they elected Ronald Reagan governor of California in the 60s. California was seriously Republican for a long time. Okay? So the party affiliations have changed, and the reason why these party affiliations have changed is, and you can go back into all the history of it. The Democrat Party actually split in half before the Civil War with the Northern Democrats and the Southern Democrats, and that split carried through for decades and decades and decades and decades and decades, and then the Southern Democrats kind of became the Republicans, and the old Southern Republicans kind of joined with the Northern Democrats, and it's weird. Anyway, it's politics. Politics. So again, California, Nevada, and we need to talk about our state. Up until 2008, up until the recession, Nevada had higher average income than California. We were above the national average, which is around 50 here. We were above the national average, and we were above California. When the recession hit, when this big recession, 2008, 9, 10 hit, Nevada got hit harder than any other state. All right? The unemployment rate in Nevada has been higher than the unemployment rate in every other, and we'll talk about this when we get there after the test. But the unemployment rate was higher in Nevada than in any other state, and it's been true for a decade, more than a decade. Okay? Right now, the unemployment rate in Nevada is the highest of all the states. So, incomes in Nevada have literally been dropping relative to the rest of the country. And part of it is also what happened in the casino business, because the casino business went from being lots and lots of family-owned casinos over the last, since the early 90s, what we've seen is giant corporations, right? So we went from nobody owned more than 2 hotels on the Strip, and it was all diverse, and there were lots of owners, to 2 companies owned 85% of all the rooms, and now we kind of have 4 companies that own, 80+% of the rooms, but you still have it's right when there stopped being competition, wages went down. So the wages in the casino business are not what they used to be, and in the business in general. So Nevada is much lower than California now, where 15 years ago we were higher than California. And so you look at how our economy works, how California's economy works. People denigrate California's economy all the time. I keep hearing how bad California is, and yet California is number 1 in a lot of education outcomes. California is number 1 in so when in business startups, New businesses being created, California's number one. Money that comes in from private investors to invest in startups, more money goes to California to invest in startups than any other state. And the reason, and a lot more money, and the reason is because the University of California system is there. Silicon Valley is there. The movie industry is there. There's particular industries that are booming in the United States, and those industries are fundamentally in California. Tesla's moved a whole bunch of stuff out of California, but not the key parts that are technology related, right? They build batteries in Nevada. They build cars other places. But the key technology pieces are still in California. So, and we're slightly better off than Utah, slightly higher than Utah. Okay? But think about why the states on the left have higher income than the states on the right. And one of the easy arguments, and we'll talk about this again, but one of the easy arguments is that those states, Massachusetts has a great higher ed system. New Jersey has a great higher ed system. New York has a great higher ed system. California has a great higher ed, right? And the Kentucky, New Mexico, South Carolina, West Virginia, and Mississippi do not have great higher education systems. Anyway, moving on.